We'll just, there you go. All right. Well, let's go ahead and jump in for this evening. One of the things I do want to do is go over some things from your assignment. And you will have noticed, so I did look over your assignments, but one of the things I want to do, and you guys will note, well, you guys will notice over the next 4 weeks, including tonight, I am rather gracious because one of the things I'm more concerned with than, and this is true when I teach at the university as well, I'm much more concerned with your learning than I am with your ability to perform on command. And what I mean by that is I'm the professor of second chances, if you want to put it that way. And so what we're going to do tonight, we'll walk through some things with the observations, because I know it's a skill that we use often, but when we approach the text, it can kind of do some funky things to us, especially with if we read the Bible for a long time, making sure we can make solid observations can be pretty easy, but it also can be a little tricky. So I don't want to talk through with you with some of that, but in going through some of that, what I want to do, we're here in week 2. We've done attendance and prayer. We're going to review homework worksheet number 1. We'll look at Genesis 1 through 22 tonight, then talk about Torah, first 5 books of the Bible known as Torah. We'll talk through a few of the kind of greatest hits in Torah. We'll take a break, and then we'll go over this golden calf incident happening in Exodus. And you will notice one of the things I was talking to AJ, I believe it was on Friday night, about this course specifically is that what we're doing in this course, you'll notice we're not going by chapter, kind of exegetically kind of unpacking each chapter, but really what we're doing, we're taking these broad theological strokes to go over these themes that are really crucial to building a foundation of understanding the major themes that are going on within Torah or within the Old Testament specifically, and looking at central aspects of what's going on in the story. So we'll hit some major things. And then when we get to week 5, we'll tie all these things together. So if you're wondering, why isn't Partita going book by book and chapter by chapter, line by line? That's why, because we're taking large, broad strokes. And in 5 weeks, we would literally need to be here like 8 hours, like once a week, to be able to go through every single thing. And so, it's really, really difficult. But one of the things I do want to go over with us is making observations. I want to do kind of a practice exercise to kind of get our, to get us thinking, to get the juices flowing, to get our observations going. Because what I think and what I've found out in working with students is that it's really easy to make observations on things that we usually find pretty usual. But when it comes to the Bible, we have a kind of habit of importing things into the text that may not necessarily be what's there. And so what I do want to be able to do with you guys right now is to be able to make some observations on this picture of what you're seeing, because there's a lot going on in this picture. There's a lot going on in this picture. And so let's go ahead, just purely making observations of what's happening, this scene that's unfolding before us. What are some observations that you guys have?
The girl is on the ground is heels.
Yeah. They're running with their heels.
Okay, there's a few that are running on their heels, and those of you that are runners, maybe like, whoa, don't want to do that.
No, she's running in a pair of high heels.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
She fell over in her high heels.
There you go.
But she's number 428 and 426. Yeah, 428, 426.
Mm-hmm. Does she appear to be the only woman in high heels?
No, many of someone else is in shoes or sandals.
Yeah.
The ones running across the line are in some type of shoes.
Yeah.
One is in a skirt.
There you go.
Oh yeah.
They all have black bottoms.
Mm-hmm.
They're running for glamour. That's who they're running for. Glamour. They all say glamour.
Yeah. Maybe it's a sponsor.
Uh-huh.
Of the race, maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
It's all women running.
Mm-hmm.
In the rain or
In the rain.
Good.
One green umbrella versus everyone else with black umbrellas in the back.
Yep.
There are
She's
more
crossing the
blondes than
finish
brunettes.
line. Looks like they're in blue and black, all of
Yep.
them, black, blue.
Looks like the one in the front is about to go sliding into first place.
Yep. Yep.
The
I
one,
think
yeah,
I think 428 was about to win, but
Something
she
happened,
couldn't
maybe.
finish the race. But she
And
couldn't finish the
They
race.
pushed her over.
Mhm.
It's interesting that they're on the cobblestone street. Maybe that's the last
Yeah.
couple of yards, but that's interesting. It's a cobblestone street.
Yeah, definitely makes it a little more difficult. Now, what if I were to say this is happening in Pittsburgh? Is that a valid observation?
I think so. I've never been to Pittsburgh, but
Yeah.
How would you know it's Pittsburgh?
Yeah, doesn't look good.
Yeah. Well, let me say this. It's raining. There's people outside running in the rain. And so it rains in Pittsburgh. So obviously it has to be Pittsburgh, right? Because that's what I've always been told is that it rains in Pittsburgh.
Washington State or Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
New York, sunny one
Okay.
month, pouring down rain the next.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Mhm.
Excellent.
And they
It
were
doesn't even have to be here. It could be London too.
There you go.
Missouri.
Rainy there too.
Yep.
I was in the Netherlands. They have lots of cobblestone streets in the Netherlands, so it could be there.
Yep. Yep. Excellent. Excellent. Now, what if I was to say they're running for breast cancer awareness?
It's not enough pink, I don't think, but
Mhm.
anything is possible.
Yeah. The
Glamour
pink,
is a
the pink in the
magazine.
back.
Yeah, it's not enough
But it's
pink.
and that's a Glamour on their little flags in the back.
Right.
And Glamour is a magazine. I don't
Mm.
see anything with the breast cancer on it. It's just pink.
Excellent.
I did a walk with cancer for cancer, and they had people out there with pink hair. I mean, literally everything was pink. So this doesn't look like it reflects that.
And I
Excellent.
think
So
it's one
It
you're
really
ex-
looks
and-
glamorous because they have the heels on and the skirt. And so that's why it looks glamorous. And they really don't look like they are sweaty either. So
Mhm.
I don't know.
Excellent. So your experience has informed part of your observation. When somebody else has observation, you know, like, yeah, well, this doesn't necessarily have the marks of what it
Mhm.
would be if this was actually that. Good. Excellent. Excellent. Anybody else? Now, what if I was to say, well, there's water on the ground, they're holding umbrellas, there's people in rain jackets. You can see a little girl in the middle, she's got rain boots on. It was raining that day at some point. Maybe it was raining when they were running, maybe earlier in the day. Therefore, it had rained at some point.
Good observation.
Okay, good. One of the things that I'm wanting for us to gather kind of by doing this, again, it's a lot easier just to look at a picture and then be able to put the components together. And then I'm gonna do this. Because I do want for us to take the same kind of principles, what's there, not interpreting what's going on, not superimposing. Well, there's this one thing I heard about this one thing, so therefore it's in this picture or it's in this text. Because again, oftentimes what can happen in our reading of scripture is that with importing certain things we've heard in the past, or just ways we've gone about reading, it can get a little tricky to read through passages without importing with just seeing what's going on in the text itself. So let me go ahead. And the thing is, that thing's gonna, okay. All right. So what I want you guys to do, if you guys want to pull up your guys' assignments that you guys had turned in, what I want you guys to do is pull up the assignment you guys, well, pull up the assignment you guys had turned in. What we'll do, we'll walk through the observations, because making really good observations is really crucial for developing not only good theology, but good theology informs good practice. And so the better we're able to understand the difference between observation and interpretation, the better off we're going to be in being able to read the text for what it says. That again, observations can lead to interpretation, but in this exercise of what we're doing for this assignment, all we're doing is observation. So let me go ahead and share that with you guys. And again, please feel free to stop me to ask questions if you guys have questions. If you want to update your observations, that would probably be a smart thing to do. I'll let, if you guys, I don't think it lets you submit more than one assignment. So if you want to, if you're going over it, like, oh my gosh, I missed this part, or yeah, I might have gone a little too far with this observation, feel free to edit it as necessary, and then resubmit it. Again, part of this, I'm wanting to develop your guys' habits of reading the text and making really good observations that informs your interpretation. So, all right, so let's go ahead. Does anybody want to read?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I cannot find my Canvas login info. I have it on my phone, but I can't pull it up on the computer. Is there a way to get that? Because it says that I can't change it or anything like that.
Your Canvas login? Do you remember which email you used to log in?
It's the only one I have, Ariana Velaz at 9.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and reset your password, then it should be able to.
It says I can't.
What? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me. Oh,
I don't know if you know who Lindsay is. She probably shot you a text message. She's AJ's assistant. You can
Yeah, I
probably
was trying to look for it because I know that it was sent to me before, but I can't find the email.
Okay, it was a text message that she sent,
Goodness.
but we can always put it in the chat. We can put her number in the chat and you can reach out to her.
Okay.
okay. Thank you so much for that, Veronica. And then if you want to email them, they're kind of our lifeline / tech support / everything support. So, all right. All right. So does anybody want to read? Also, are there any other questions, comments, concerns, thoughts?
I'll read it.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Orlando. Nice and loud for the class.
Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say you shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat from the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die." But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then their eyes both were open, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves.
Awesome. Awesome. So what are some of the observations that you had on this text? You guys can pull up your assignments, revisit it. You don't have to make up brand new ones. If there is something in there that you saw for the first time, kind of in rereading the text, feel free to jump in. But what did you guys get from the text? What are some of the observations that you made?
The serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal.
Good. The serpent.
There is a serpent. There's a woman.
The serpent could talk, or at least share the information? Was it telepathy? Was it talking? Serpents don't have vocal cords.
Yep.
Just saying.
That's a good
Yep.
one.
Yep.
The serpent deceived Eve with just a few words.
Hmm. Where do you see the word deceived?
Well, I don't see the word deceived, but he is the deceiver, right? So
Where, yeah, where in the text is it called the serpent the deceiver?
it's not.
Yeah. See, so those are one of the things that I wanted to pay attention to. That can be deduced
Mhm.
from what the text might be inferring. But again, it's one of those things. So in talking about like, hey, this event might be in Pittsburgh because it rains in Pittsburgh. And so bringing in previous knowledge into the text that flavors the text in a certain way that the words might not necessarily be that. Again, doesn't mean it's wrong.
Mhm.
And we know that from, again, it's in other places where the possibility for who the person of the serpent is. But that's assuming that there's a connection, which we often make between the serpent and Satan. But in the text, there's no inference that the serpent is the devil in this specific text.
Right.
Not importing from the New Testament, not importing Augustine, but just looking at the Old Testament, seeing what it's saying on its own within its own context. That is just a snake that talks. We don't know why or how. Again, where the vocal cords came from, it's just a snake that talks.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I in my reading, so when I was doing the homework, I started typing the answers, and then I realized as I kept going back and forth, I kept typing my observations, I realized it never said Eve. And so I had typed my homework, Eve, in these particular places. But then all of a sudden something dawned on me and I went back and I'm using the CEB and I realized it never said anything about Eve. They just said the woman. And
Excellent.
so then I had to go back and reread the whole thing again just to make sure I was getting it right.
Excellent. Excellent. Why? Because the woman isn't named at this point, or at least she doesn't have a name yet.
Right. And I kept speaking and saying, I was dialoguing with my husband about it. And we were talking about Eve. And I'm trying to pull these things. And he's kind of pushing it like, well, what do you think about this? And he's asking me these questions. And then finally, when I go in and now I'm alone and I'm starting to really think about it, I go and I say to him, we talked about Eve and it never said anything about Eve at all in the CEB.
Oh, and do you think that kind of ambiguity is on purpose or accidental?
On purpose.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yes.
Because again, especially if this text is meant to be read out loud, that the ability for a people to be able to insert themselves into certain places, it's a lot easier to do when you have these kind of nameless characters. It's kind of embodiment of a group of people. All right. What else? What other observations? That's so good. There's so much there in that one observation. If you guys can kind of pick up what she's putting down.
And I also want to add to that her husband is not named either. It just says her husband.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Excellent.
Her husband is with her.
That's another important part too, because women always get blamed. Well, Eve ate the fruit, her fault. Even Paul does the same thing, but even though he's doing something different, but.
I got something different because it doesn't
Go
say
ahead.
that it doesn't say that he was with her. It says that he was with her when she ate it.
No.
So, but it doesn't say that in the beginning when they were talking that he was with her. It doesn't.
Yeah.
You're inferring that she wasn't with her in the beginning, right? It doesn't say. It just says that he was with her and he ate also.
See,
Doesn't tell us if he was there.
Yeah, and this is where English leads us astray, because in verse 3 in Hebrew, it's, did God say, any of our Southern brothers and sisters in the house would know, did God say, y'all shall not eat from the tree of the garden? So it's in the plural, where y'all captures or you all captures better than just the singular you. That's where it kind of leads us astray a little bit, by the kind of phrasing of just you. We assume it's singular, but you all is probably the better version of it. It's just nobody's going to put that in the Bible. But yeah, if you want to put that in there, so a lot, and then, but God said, y'all shall not eat of the fruit of the garden, fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, or shall you touch it or die. But the fact that the serpent primarily addresses the woman, doesn't address the male. We don't know why. We don't know why that is. But one of the things that we do know is that the man doesn't say a single thing while this whole interaction is happening. But who was told? We'll do this. But who was? We don't want to jump too far to interpretation, but just to kind of bring up the point, who was told the command of not to eat from the tree of the garden?
Adam was.
So there's something going on here with the man's silence while there's a whole discussion going on between the two. So maybe it's not the woman's failure, but rather the failure of the man to instruct the woman in the ways in which how to keep Torah, or what God's saying to do. So that's something to pay attention to as well.
Well, I kind of took from that,
Mm-hmm.
and then my homework I wrote. So when I realized that, and I came across with the same thing Ariana said. So as I was thinking through that, then I thought, let me go back. Did she eat in front of the serpent, or did the serpent leave, or did she leave and did she go and get the man and then offered him the food? It doesn't say
That's where I was
ate the food,
yeah.
ate whatever it was, and then moved on. It doesn't say that.
Yeah, there does seem to be a little bit here who was with her.
Right, but we don't know was he standing the whole time that she was having this conversation.
Yeah, it seems to be implied right here with the you being in plural. They're together.
Okay.
Yeah, they're together.
Okay, but you knew that was
See,
a
for
plural.
me, it says like it seemed like there was a pause in between 5 and 6.
Mm.
So it seems like that their talking happened somewhere, and then it wasn't all like within like minutes. It didn't boom, boom, boom happen, it seems, because it says, so when the women saw the tree. Well, it doesn't say like right then, you know?
But when we're doing observation, though, whenever we say it seems, or it sounds,
Yeah,
or it looks, or maybe it's in Pittsburgh, then that's where the problem is, right in this observation.
yeah.
So another one is they know how to sew, which I find it very interesting, because how would they ever know how to sew? But apparently they know how to sew, right? And they have needles or whatever, I don't know, whatever you sew with.
However,
Yeah,
for
vines, roots, who knows? All right,
So
good.
would the saying say the woman was not afraid of the snake because she spoke back to him? Would that be an observation, or would that be an interpretation?
That's more interpretive, because there's nothing in the text that necessarily indicates a certain kind of emotional projection, at least within the conversation. That would be a question you can ask. A lot of these can make really good questions. So when we go a little too far on the interpretive side, we can turn those interpretations into questions. Everything from how in the world does the snake talk? What is the role of snakes in this ancient world? Was there a time gap in between 5 and 6 when the woman goes and gets the male? How in the world is it so normal for this woman to talk to the snake? Is there something going on here where there's some familiarity between what the woman knows and does, and between the snake? How does the snake know what God said? Like all these kinds of questions, they may not be answered by the text, but they're nonetheless, they're questions that we can ask about the text, that if we're sincere and wondering about these things, it's absolutely any and all these questions that we do have about what's going on inside of this story that may be outside the purview of what this text immediately says, but we still have questions about. And when we engage in research and looking into outside sources about the text, they may get answered, but they may not as well. And we have to be okay with that. But one of the things I do want to, I always want to pay attention to is what are some of the words that are repeated here in this passage?
Serpent,
Serpent, yep.
Die.
Hmm?
Die.
Die, good,
Die.
good.
God,
God, yep. What else?
tree,
Yes. Fruit is really important, but trees are really, really, really important in the Old Testament. Like really important, to the point where they'll come up again in the New Testament when there's this guy who claims to be the Son of God who dies upon a tree.
right?
And so these trees become really important all throughout the Old Testament. And it starts here in these kinds of places where you have in the center of a garden, what's there?
Tree.
And in between, real
and
quick,
eight.
and in between two, if you go to New Testament, in between two thieves or criminals, there's a tree. And so again, so you see that small observation that can get so much mileage out of the text about the importance. And somebody just said tree. And what this fruit is able to provide for those who eat from the tree.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So looking at this text, I used the CE, well, first, two questions. One, why do we use either the CEB or the NRSV?
Mhm.
And because I use the CEB and it looks totally different than the NRSV. So
Yeah.
why do we use these?
One of them, it's a little bit of preference. The other one, the big reason is because one is the readability of both texts and the way that they're written, and the other one is that they really they do better to capture idea for idea while grammatically retaining a lot within the original text as well. And so that's why those two specifically.
Okay.
Yeah, because you have some translations that, like the NASB, that's word for word literal, but it reads a little awkwardly. And you have others like the NIV or the NLT that'll read idea for idea, but doesn't necessarily give you what's going on in the original language. So these two, NRSV and CEB, kind of capture the middle ground between the two really well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I forgot my second question, but it was something along these lines.
Okay. Awesome. Well, if you remember, just go ahead and
Thank you.
shout it out. You got it. All right. Anybody else? Any other things that we want to pay attention to? Any other words?
I had put in there, because the previous chapter, she actually added to what God had actually said. Like,
Yes.
she added to it.
Yes. What part did she add?
Touch.
Touch. Yeah.
What?
Yep. Nor shall you touch it. Good. Good.
Also eyes, right? Eyes.
Heather, it's so important. Like we need to have this idea in mind when we talk about eyes. Not only because in this text, but in other texts throughout the Old Testament, what people see between what's happening here, and then you have instances of idolatry, but then you also have instances where God makes his presence manifest. When Abraham in Genesis 22, he's going to go and see that emphasis on the eyes is going to come up again later on. But again, everything starts out in these few chapters of what's going on between what's happening with the eyes. Because again, in verse 6, a delight to the eyes. Verse 7, then the eyes of both were open. Verse 5, when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. So there's something that's going on between what's happening with these, the retinas, the iris, the corneas, the veins, the blood, everything going on in here that the Bible is trying to get us to pay attention to. But only in as much as it's trying to point us to what's going on in here as well, in our hearts. Now, there's a connection
Is-
between the two.
Is that why she said, I'm sorry, I'm looking at 3 screens here.
Ah,
Is
you're good.
that why she said, or in the scripture, it says that she saw that it had wisdom, the tree had wisdom. And I was trying to figure out now, again, the CEB, and I was trying to understand how she could see wisdom. Like all of a sudden, she spoke to the serpent, or in CB, the snake, and then all of a sudden it was as if she just looked to the tree. The tree all of a sudden looked good. Well, what did it look like before? And then the tree, she sees wisdom. Like, well, how do you see wisdom in this tree?
That's-
And why didn't you ever see all of this before?
That's such a good question. Such a good question. And that's something the text, it leaves it a little ambiguous. What was it about this fruit that lets her see something that she didn't see before?
They obviously weren't physically blind,
Mm-hmm.
is the spiritual blindness.
Where's that in the text?
Well, she said, well, as you deduce, when they ate the fruit, all of a sudden their eyes were opened,
Mm-hmm.
is to understanding their spirit, their mental.
Yeah. Again, the only problem is
It didn't
that,
say the physical eyes.
yeah, the only problem is we have to ask, what does it mean for their eyes to be open, even though they can already see?
Right.
Because again, we're inferring within the text that it's making reference to spirit or something spiritual when it's not necessarily specifically there in the text. And again, when we do the research and it corroborates or answers that question, then we can go ahead and throw it in. But at this point, it's not in the text specifically. Go ahead. Oh. We're having some trouble hearing.
I was
Brianna.
just saying that it says no is attached to that. So, oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I was saying, it says knowing,
Uh-huh.
like, so that it was like coupling, their eyes were opened and they would know. So it's not like seeing.
So what's going on between their eyesight and what they know, what they've learned or what they've now apprehended? So there's something going on there again that it's to go back here to what is happening here with verse 4. When you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. And what happens to them? And then again, this is part of the pushback. Like what the serpent says is going to happen, it happens.
But don't we not but don't we have a translation? I mean, there's something nuanced in translation, right? Because it says that she could see that it was desirable for knowledge, I think is the quote. If somebody has it open, you can see that. But that's kind of to know, right? And is it to see literally? What's the word? And I guess we go do a word study or whatever, but she understood, right? She understood that it was desirable for knowledge. And that understanding may have come from what the serpent told her. We don't, right? We infer that, but that the idea of this, of seeing it and seeing wisdom, like was mentioned earlier, it's really, she understood that that was desirable for not in order to gain something she didn't have, right? And the only way we know that is to know what is really translated as she saw that it was desirable for knowledge, or whatever the English phrase is, right? Is that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And again, when we come upon those kinds of things, it's good to ask lots of questions. That, again, this thing what's going on between their eyes being open and knowing that they were naked, like of all things for them to know, they knew that they were naked. Like, why of all things? Like, they didn't possess supernatural knowledge or supernatural abilities or powers, but they knew that they were naked. Why that?
Well, I think anybody that has kids, well, maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but anybody that has kids on it, your kids run around naked on the beach when they're 2,
Mhm.
right? They don't even, they're innocent. They don't even realize that there's any attachment to that kind of stuff, right? I mean, that's the obvious one for us. That's the one we're born into, and it would be the first, right? That's your birthday suit to begin with.
Mhm.
So that only becomes stained, perverted, different
Mhm.
when you understanding beyond that for which it was meant, right? When you're taking something beyond what it was meant, that seems to me that's a clear one, because you see that innocence in children, and then when they're not children anymore and they're not quote unquote innocent,
Mhm.
that becomes an embarrassment, right? That becomes a thing. That becomes something that
Yeah.
it never was before, right?
Yeah.
So to me, that just makes sense. I don't know how anybody else feels, but
Yeah, definitely.
How did they not see that they were naked before they ate the fruit?
They did. They saw, Pastor Miles will say maybe they were covered in light or something. No, I don't think that's it at all. I think that they saw they were naked, but they didn't understand there was any context of that being wrong or not normal or whatever else, right?
Mhm.
And in creation, that was normal. That's the way that's how God had made them. There wasn't anything to be sneaky or snaky about, right?
Was that
Until
was
they had
that
a
not
different
the moment?
understanding.
Was that not the moment that man and God were separated? When they ate it?
That's see the wording there is particular because it's not when man and God are separated, it's when humankind starts to separate themselves from God and one another. And that's what
Their
we'll see.
spirit died, right?
We'll see teased out in chapter 3. Again, that's not within what the text is trying to get at. What we do see, though, within the text, especially as chapter 3 goes on, is this wedge that gets driven called sin in between humans with one another and then humans with God. I'll address it right now because maybe you guys have heard this, but this phrase that you shall, some people will translate it, you shall surely die, you shall die. That one of them is like a spiritual death, the other one is a physical death. The problem with that is that that's not what the intention of the Hebrew is. It's just adding more emphasis. Anytime you have a word that's repeated twice in Hebrew, it's always adding emphasis. So when you hear stuff like Moses in Exodus, Abraham in Genesis, when anything's repeated twice, it's added for emphasis. We do the same thing in English. When we say, man, this cheeseburger was really, really good. Man, that burrito spot is really, really bad. My knee hurts just really, 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 really excruciatingly bad. So we do the same thing for emphasis. When we repeat a word, we do the same thing. And so what the intention is that when these humans are supposed to eat from this tree, they were for sure supposed to die. For sure. And again, this is more jumping towards interpretation. But what happens is that the Lord withholds. He of course has judgment for the man. He has judgment for the woman. But what does he do after he kicks him out of the garden? He goes with them despite the sin that is driving a wedge. And so now God's got to figure out, okay, how am I going to bring these people back?
So if you think about it this way, it's like almost like when they were walking in the garden with God, they were factory perfect, but we haven't really taken the idea that now, because their eyes were open to good and evil, they saw the shame. They felt shameful, and that's a human nature, right? That we all live with this shame or judgment or anything, not that God is putting on us, but we put on ourselves.
Yeah. And so with that being said, again, it's one of the things we're wanting to pay attention to with the text, that to suspend application for a point. And when we do have those things that do come up, we ask questions about, does it mean this? Can it mean this? Can it mean this? In order to be able to see the text and what it's trying to say on its own, and allowing the text to speak on its own terms. And so when we do see areas like that are coming up later on in Genesis 3, to be able to see some of the disconnect between the man and the woman, between humanity themselves and God. A lot of it happening because of choices that humans make, choices that we make. And not just simply saying the devil made me do it. And so with this exercise, again, if there's things in here that you guys are wanting to refine for you guys' assignment or resubmit it, please feel free to do so. But this is kind of the practices of what we're trying to do, of just seeing what's there. And again, I'll reiterate that one of the things I do want to encourage you guys to do is pay attention to those words that seem really important, even if you're not sure if it's important. Let's say just to even make a note like, hey, this seems to be a major point. It seems to be a major theme. This seems to be a central passage. Because one of the things I didn't bring up that should come up is the fact that there's these two questions that prompt the beginning of this discussion. And you'll want to note, especially when we move on to different texts, who's asking the question? What is the question about? Who's asking the question? And what is the question about? Especially when the Lord starts asking questions and the content of that question, because that'll be a big driver both of conversation and activity in the Old Testament. And so are there any, we'll keep going through observations and working on being better observers of the text and allowing the text to speak, but are there any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, regrets?
I have one thing that I thought about when I was reading it. She was talking to the serpent. Was she able to talk to all the other animals as well?
Yeah. Why a serpent? Why that one animal?
And
I swear my dog talks to me sometimes. But...
I was thinking, can serpent mean other things? Like, is it a dragon? I mean, because they have like things like that in mythology and whatnot. So, and I mean, who knows? Dinosaurs were back then too. So maybe it's not a snake, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll bring up this point. It's more from external research. But so snakes in the ancient world were representative of wisdom, a kind of alternative form of wisdom. And so you have these competing wisdoms, one that says, follow Yahweh and his word and his guidance and his teaching. And another one that says, go ahead, do your own thing, because Yahweh is you'll be better off and you'll become like Yahweh, you'll become like God by following this alternative path to wisdom. And so you can start to see where some of the nuggets are when you do a little bit of background research and asking that question, why a snake? What's the importance? What's the significance of a snake in the ancient world at the time period? And to be able to pull these kinds of things out from the text of being able to ask questions like that. Like, why a snake? Why couldn't it have been a beaver? Why couldn't it have been a cat? They had lots of cats back then. And so again, but you start to see the kind of intentionality of the original authors to include those kinds of elements. And that by including those kinds of elements, what kind of messages, these loaded messages of what they're delivering to this original audience, and by extension to us, about the ways in which we often seek our own versions of wisdom in order not to necessarily become like God, but at least to be able to have some control, some autonomy, to be able to say, I am Lord over my own life, and I want to be able to do whatever it is that I want, however I want. And so, which that's all of us. That's all of us. The war that we all got to go through and to continually submit ourselves to the Lord every day. And to be able to not to trust in our own understanding, but to trust in the Lord with all of our heart. And so yeah, so that's.
I had a question. What was the other, who's asking the question and what was the second one?
What's the question about?
Yeah, what's the content of the question? You'll get a lot of mileage after asking questions about questions. Or noting what are the questions about?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Wayne.
And the question is about, and help me understand too, is I know that when God gave, when the command was given not to eat from the tree, Eve was not around
Yeah.
when it was given, right? So now we're in the third chapter, and so she's having a conversation with a serpent that knows what God says. So my question is, how did Eve? Well, how did the serpent find out about what God said, and then how did Eve find out about what God said? Because she wasn't around when he said it.
Those are very good questions. Very good questions that the text doesn't necessarily fully flesh out for us.
Thank you.
Yeah. And again, one of the things that we can, if we can get a little creative, is that we can assume part of the, because Adam got the word, got that commandment not to eat from the tree. And then we'll move on after this. But after that, you would think that he has a responsibility to pass that along to his wife.
Mhm.
That, hey, God said we can't do this. Not so much that he's the teacher extraordinaire, as much as he's the one that heard, and he's got a responsibility to pass it along. So in as much as we might perceive it to be a failure of the woman, it's also the failure of the man to pass along what he's heard.
I was concerned about the man being there when he was talking to a snake. If my husband saw me talking to a snake, there would have been some action. And it was like, right there, and she's talking to the snake. If my husband saw me talking to somebody that looked like a snake, there would be some kind of action.
Yeah, I was about to say, there's some people that we probably talk to, and all of a sudden you got husbands looking sideways. So, yeah, no, there's something going on with that text, but yeah, it's fun to ask these kinds of questions and try to figure out what's going on. And some of them will find answers, but other times we're gonna have to kind of fill in the gap. But when we do fill in the gaps, it's already using the best resources available to us to make sense of the story without overly kind of twisting it in order to make a certain point, which happens probably more often than we realize. And so we're going to go ahead and jump into our discussion for tonight, is continuing throughout the Old Testament and talking about Torah. So Torah is training in morality. And what we mean by morality, it includes the do's and the don'ts, the rights and the wrongs, but even more so, when we think of the word Torah, one of the words that we're tempted to think of is law, legal. The problem is that when we think of law, we tend to think of like, don't go over 45 or don't go over 65, don't kill your neighbor, don't rob a bank, all the legal stuff that'll get you into lots of trouble if you break government law. But one of the things, if I can help us to reimagine this word Torah, if we can reimagine those first 5 books of the Bible, and I put it before you guys as a suggestion and as a brother, that we might better think of this word as teaching, instruction, something more like what we see what's going on in Proverbs of a dad talking to his son and talking to his kids. What this is what's being handed from God down to his people is a kind of way in which they ought to go, that this is wisdom, a source of life, a kind of guidance in the way that the people ought to go in following this God who has brought them from the hand of Pharaoh, delivered them from the land of Egypt, the house of slavery, and teaching them how to be his people. Teaching them how to be his people. And so Dr. Karen Winslow, professor over at APU, that its training in morality assumes the need for it, and the human intelligence and the ability to make choices can lead to horrendous evil. And so again, that it's a kind of training, a teaching, instructions that wrap up this, that embody this word Torah or Torah, these first 5 books of the Old Testament. That taken together, we can start to reframe it instead of just seeing. So one of the classes I do teach at the university is called Pentateuch. It's the same thing, Torah. That I try to help students to reimagine Leviticus. And you can imagine for a bunch of 18, 19-year-olds at 7:30 in the morning, there's nothing more exciting than digging through Leviticus. Bunch of texts that go back and forth between telling stories and then talking about what the do's and don'ts are for the Aaronic priesthood. But one of the things I emphasize to them, and I want to emphasize to you guys, that this is Yahweh teaching his people, not leaving them to assume that they know how to worship, not leaving them to assume that they know how to enter into Yahweh's presence, not leaving them to kind of just make it up on their own, but rather as a teacher, as a guide, as a father over his household, because the patriarch was the one responsible for teaching the household and making sure that they all kept codes and they all abided by certain agreements. That it's Yahweh instructing his people, that demonstration of grace, that this thing is not just a book of laws meant to be kept, but rather a demonstration of Yahweh's grace, that in his presence and in his teaching, he's provided these things on how to be his people. How to be his people. Because again, there's very few things that are more cruel than telling somebody to go do something and then not giving them any kind of guidance on how to do it. And anybody who's had a manager or had a trainer on a new job, when you just kind of like left to fend to the wolves, or you left to fend to yourselves, it's rough. It's rough. Valley, you all right? Yep.
Having some flashbacks. That is rough.
Yeah. Heather, what's up?
I was just saying same.
Oh,
same.
yeah?
I feel you.
Yeah. And so giving your guys' experience, like it's just, it's rough. But we have a God who's gracious and compassionate and kind, and who provides a way of instruction to his people, to his kids. And that's what we have with the first 5 books. And so you can see why in certain places, like in the prophets, when you have the prophets calling back to Torah, calling back to what they call the law, what you might hear the book of the law, it's instruction, and calling them back to Yahweh's instruction, calling them back to Yahweh's path, calling them back to faithfully keep this thing that is not just a book of rules, but rather this teaching the way they ought to go for the benefit of everyone in the community. So I'll tell you this up front, wherever there's idolatry, there's going to be injustice. Wherever there's injustice, there's going to be idolatry. We're going to see this come up a lot later on, especially in the monarchy. We're going to see this come up a lot in the prophets. Whenever Israel goes astray, because of idolatry, injustice isn't going to be far behind. Now, it's fair to say the same still holds true today. Idolatry and injustice is going to be linked together. And so this call back to Torah is going to be foundational for the people of Israel. And so composed of the Torah, we've already said Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and some would even say Joshua as a kind of round 2 to Deuteronomy, as it picks up a lot of the what's going on with the people being on the kind of precipice about to enter into the promised land. Some of the important events of the Torah, first 5 books. Genesis 1 through 11, creation narrative. The patriarchs, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. We can chalk up Joseph into the mix as well. But anytime you see the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's in reference to those 3 during this time period. And the relationship was raw. It was real, bare bones, just us and Yahweh, us and the Lord. And that covers most of Genesis. And takes us, and the story of Joseph does serve as a kind of hinge point between what's going on in Genesis with the patriarchs and getting us over down into Egypt. Because again, these guys, these people who are writing this Torah, they're literary geniuses. And so the story of Joseph gets us from the land of Canaan, where Jacob and his family were at, and bring us down into Egypt, which kicks off the Exodus.
Would you be able to post this PowerPoint? Last week's PowerPoint was posted.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Thank you for that.
Mhm. You have Mount Sinai and the 10 words, also known as the 10 Commandments, but in Hebrew, the Devarim, or word, matter of thing. Again, commandments, we take it to be kind of legal, not legalistic, but legal, like this is our specific legal commands, but rather, again, in line with what we've been talking about with Torah as teaching or instruction. These are 10 words instructing the people on what to do and what not to do. And then Deuteronomy, which goes about retelling the teaching to a new generation, retelling the teaching to a new generation. And we'll talk about it when we get there, but it don't go so good for Israel. And so reading the Torah, reading Torah. So when we talk about reading these first 5 books, that's Pentateuch. Pentateuch is just the first 5 books. It's interchangeable with Torah. As a decisive role to play with respect to its form and rhetorical strategy. And what that just means is that that we have to pay attention to what's going on with the different genres that are there. I had mentioned last time that we have poetry. We have a lot of poetry. And with poetry, we have to be careful that we don't take things literally, like you have within the Psalms that God is a rock. Now, does that literally mean God is a boulder out in the universe? No, because we know it's a figure of speech. Though that rock is trying to point towards something of what God's characteristic is like. That he's enduring. He's strong. He can take on a lot. He can weather things. And so by reading poetry, we got to see what's going on there. And just a heads up, Genesis 1 and 2, with the way that it's written as poetry. Written as poetry. So again, there's more there that we've got to figure out. You have law, which needs to be read within its context as well. And a lot of the way that law will be written is contextual. Contextual. Very specific to a set context. And this is really important for us to recognize within the Old Testament, because what happens often is that God will meet the people where they are at. God will meet the people where they are at. And including within Exodus with the 10 plagues, God meets Pharaoh right where he's at. Speaking to him in a language that makes sense to him. And God does the same thing today. God meets us where we're at and speaks to us in ways that make sense to us. Most times. Other times, we have no idea what's going on. We don't figure it out till a couple of years later. But so these are kinds of things that we need to pay attention to when we're reading Torah. This is, again, a lot of the poetry and the legal. We understand how to read narratives. We grew up reading books. We identify characters, plot lines, conflicts, resolutions, and those kinds of things that are mixed in with legal texts. Again, that are very contextual, so we got to pay attention to that. And then also with poetry, paying attention to what are some of the dynamics or some of the rules that are a little bit different than for the other ones. For something like legal. Legal is going to be very literal, but it's also going to be very contextual. So when you read something like, hey, should your ox fall into a ditch and it dies and you got to repay your neighbor that oxen, and then plus a little something, very contextual. Very contextual. And so let me see how much we have here. I'm going to briefly go over this because I do want to be able to take a break here in a couple minutes and answer some questions. Let's go through a couple of these, and then we'll go ahead and take a break around 8 o'clock. So Genesis, first of all, are there any questions? Any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? Let me take a break here to pause. Give us a little bit of time to breathe and to. There's been a lot of information presented to you all. Thoughts? Does any of this get you guys uncomfortable? Is it pretty familiar? Is it liberating? Is it challenging for you all? Are you personally?
I personally feel like it's refreshing.
Hmm.
Kind of, it's eye-opening to me.
Good.
Some of it maybe I've already never heard before, but I feel like
Good. Excellent. Thank you so much, Heather. Appreciate that.
For me, it's challenging, and one of the
Huh.
reasons I think is because having a greater understanding, should I say now, of how to study the Old Testament. Because for years, I would do the Greek and the Hebrew lexicon, right? And then you limited, or I was limited, should I say, in what they offered. And so I could only take what was said and whatever information I got from that was as far as I can take it. But now I see that there's a wealth of information that needs to take place to allow me to dig a little bit deeper. So that's the challenging part of it, which is great, because it just it's like candy for me. I just love this. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, and there's plenty of candy here. Plenty of candy. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Anybody else?
I think it's awesome that we're able to look at the Bible a different way than we've been naturally. Well, for me, I watch a lot of preachers and stuff, and they impose different things or whatever. But for me to just to take my pair of eyes and be able to like dive in, and make my own observations and just continue to ask different questions. And I just think it's cool, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, excuse me, there's so much that can be gleaned just from making observations on the text. So much can be gleaned. Like Jan just brought up the fact that the woman isn't named. Like, that's huge. Huge. Ariana, you brought up the bit with trees. The fact that trees are there, and as you continue to read the Bible, you start to think about it. Like, man, there's trees everywhere. Like, what's going on with this tree, and even the fact that there's a garden there in Genesis. When I flipped over to the Gospels, that there's a garden there. Is there a connection between these two different gardens? When I go over to Revelation, there's another garden. And what's the deal with gardens? God likes to hang out in these places where there's a lot of trees.
I thought about something I thought about something when you were talking, is even making observations of people. And how many times do we look at people and we'll just go with the first thing that we think or the first thing that we thought we heard, but taking the time to really get to know that person and get to truly understand that person in their heart. And you begin to understand why they do what they do or how they react, instead of just judging the person just based on that first sight.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And being able to take a step back.
But I have to admit, it's really hard because as human beings, we assemble our observations based on our life experiences, right? And so if we've read the Bible before, we're basing it on a preacher's testimony, or we're basing it on what we've read before, or stories we've heard over periods of time and years. So really decipher, learning the difference between the interpretation and the observation, is kind of a little bit of a struggle.
Absolutely. And Elisar, you lift your hand up.
Oh, I wanted to add to a couple of people what they were saying about. I guess when we had to read the verses over and over and over, it just kind of shocked me how after about the fourth or fifth time, there were things that I noticed, and I was like, I really felt like the Holy Spirit was like, looky here, you missed that the first time or the second time, and it wasn't tedious like I thought it would be because of that revelation, those little things that popped out. There were only a couple, but it was just cool to see how, just like you were saying, Valerie, about like not really knowing someone or making assumptions. It's like, I think, sometimes it's the opposite. We may know we read that same scripture and we know this, we'll read something over and over and over. And then one day the Holy Spirit reveals something to you. But in this, it was a little bit different. I don't know. I just really thought that was kind of cool, that learning how we just kind of pass over things out of repetition. And if we really ask the Holy Spirit to show us, like, I don't know, it's those secrets that we always hear about, that the Lord just reveals. And I found that very pretty awesome. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, yeah, you're gonna jump in with something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I really like the book that we're reading. That's really helped me because before, like you were saying about your class about Leviticus and just going through, it's like all these, to me, it was like, oh, you should do this, you have to do this, you have to do that, don't do that. Yep. And so like reading like what it meant to them and like what God was trying to show them, it's like, oh, so it wasn't just don't do this and don't do this. It's like how to interact with God and that relationship. And it really brought some light to like, oh, okay, so what's the theme here? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. Well, yeah, I know a lot of this can be challenging for us, and I just want to continue to encourage us. And continue to encourage us to just to press into the challenge, to be able to persevere through the challenge, and to be able to see that the Lord is growing you, shaping you, challenging you, and being able to reveal more about Himself, and to be able to challenge us in the ways in which not only our approach to Scripture, but then also the way in which we see the world a little bit differently as a result. Because of it, because again, what this whole thing is trying to do, especially with the Old Testament, is trying to push us towards living under God's rule and reign as the chief king, the one who's the God above all gods, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, especially in the world within the Old Testament, where the thought that there's other deities out there that are competing for control, that's the world that they live in. But it's not to say that that's not a world unfamiliar to us, where there are other competing, maybe not necessarily deities, like in the world that they had before, where there's local kind of gods. But now, with the world we're living in, there's other things that are desiring of our affection, of our loyalties, of our time, of our energies, and the things that we give ourselves over towards. And what the Old Testament is pushing us towards is that God's the supreme one that is deserving of our time, our attention, our focuses, our energies, and living under his rule and reign. That's the path of wisdom. Even if it doesn't make sense, which for most of us, you know that full well, making decisions that don't make sense, but yet still maintaining the trust and the loyalty and the confidence in Jesus, even when it doesn't really make sense, which is most of our lives. And so, but that's what the Old Testament is trying to get at us, is that the wise life, the true way to life is living under God's rule and reign, not knowing certain things, not knowing a lot of things, and well-being, but trusting that God is still good. God is still good, and especially in a world like what we're living in right now, it takes a lot of faith to make that claim in the times and days that we're living in. So let me go ahead. I don't mean to run through this too quick because I know we still want to take a break here pretty soon. So we do have the kind of these major happenings. I don't know why Genesis 12 is in here, because that's going to be really important. But one of the key chapters that we do have within Genesis, and I'm going to bring up a couple, is Genesis 15. This is specific to Abraham and the covenant. Again, you will have gone through this in your reading, so it won't be anything new. And the covenant that's made there, and then 17 with circumcision as the kind of sign, the mark of being God's people. And that'll be very important in you guys' reading the New Testament, especially in a book like or in a letter like Galatians. But then even with Genesis 16 and Hagar, we want to pay attention to characters like Hagar that don't get a lot of play. The Hagar who's forced into mistreatment, who's run off because of jealousy, and who's left as a pregnant woman to fend for herself. God meets her in the middle, pretty much on a kind of last line. She turns away from her son because she doesn't want to see him die, but it's there where God meets her. And there's a good lot to learn, because this will bring up thematically something that's going to be really important in the Old Testament, especially all throughout the Bible, really, but especially in the Old Testament. When you have characters, one like Hagar, who's an outsider because of her ethnicity, and second, because she's a woman. The ways in which God is at work with people like this shows from the beginning God's heart for inclusivity, even when God's people on the inside are very much desiring to be exclusive. So God, who has this missional heart for inclusivity, reaches out and shows himself faithful to this woman who's on the outside, begins a theme that will be picked up and teased out all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament as well, with the inclusion of Gentiles being engrafted into Israel. That God's got a heart for the outsiders, and Jesus' life on earth says as much. How consistent Jesus is with reaching out to those that are largely marginalized. Lepers, Samaritans, discussions with women. The women with the issue of blood. Again, those that are considered fringe characters. Now Jesus consistently shows the heart that God's always had, which is those on the margins. And then Genesis 22 with Abraham and Isaac. So I do need to pick it up a little bit here. We have Exodus, again with the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who proved to be the first, I don't know if it's ever in history, but at least biblically, of civil disobedience. And their civil disobedience is blessed by God. They refused to kill these Hebrew baby boys. And God blesses them for it. These Egyptian women. And so while Pharaoh goes unnamed, this powerful king or perceived to be powerful king, you have these two midwives that are named. And this is just a heads up as you guys are reading. Oftentimes what would happen in ancient books is that if you really wanted to disrespect your enemies, you would leave their names out of books. So if you wanted to talk smack, what you would do, if you ended up saying like, hey, we went over, we fought these dudes, we busted their lip and ran away, and we just walked away. You don't even bother naming names. Why? Because they're not worthy to be named. You just don't even think about it. Just, I don't know them. And the same thing's going on in Exodus with not naming the Pharaoh. But who do you have? You have these Egyptian midwives that are named. And you have Yahweh who shares his name. You have Zipporah, Moses' wife, who saves him, saves his life, literally saves his life. And you have Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, those 10 words or 10 commandments. And then what we're going to be taking a pause today to work on for this evening is Exodus 32 with the golden calf. Exodus 32 with the golden calf. So I'm going to save this for later because it does go over Leviticus in more detail. And then with numbers, again, broad strokes with numbers. Yeah, the priestly blessing. And this is really important, especially after what we're going to read today. And this is really important to keep in mind. What this priestly blessing represents in numbers is Yahweh's commitment to Israel despite their rebellion. Lord bless you, Lord keep you. That whole song happens right after they had just built this golden calf and decided this golden calf is our God now. They're not saying that this is a new God, but rather Yahweh is this calf. It's kind of more syncretist, this conjoining of practices. And we'll talk about why that's a no-no and how it breaks the first few commandments right off the bat. And so again, this priestly blessing that operates as Yahweh's commitment to this people despite their rebellion. And again, it'll throw us for a loop if we think about it too long. The fact that God still stays committed despite what people do. You have Moses' failure in Numbers 17 through 20. Then you start to see what happens with the people's grumbling and complaining, which that grumbling and complaining, it's not so much asking God to be able to do what he says he's going to do, but rather making God try to prove himself. Because you have all throughout the Psalms a lot of complaining. A lot of complaints. Jesus says a complaint from the cross from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? But again, it has less to do with asking sincere questions that are desiring for God to act, and much more to do with God trying to make God prove himself, which is what the meaning of when Jesus says in Matthew 4, then again in Luke, whereas you're not going to test the Lord or put the Lord to God to the test. It's literally trying to make God force his hand to prove himself. And that's what the people want Yahweh to do. So what happens? Snakes. You want God to prove himself? Here you go. Here's some snakes. And then what you end up having in 21, where the snake actually becomes the object of healing, that they are supposed to look to a pole in order to be healed, but the pole looks like a snake. And so again, we have to ask what's going on with snakes. So last, before we take a break here, you have the teaching that happens again. Deuteronomy 1 through 5, you have that historical retelling. The repetition of Yahweh repeating the story of his delivering the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, Literally, Shema means to hear. To hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then Deuteronomy 34, the death of Moses. So sad. Which marks the beginning of a new period with Joshua. All right. Well, are there any questions, comments, concerns? We're gonna take a break here, but I do want to at least be able to see, are there any questions? All right. Well, let's go ahead. Let's take a 15-minute break. Is that okay with everybody? That can be enough to use the bathroom, get something to drink, get something to eat, check on the dog, check the kids. All right, so let's go ahead and meet back up in 15 minutes, and then we'll jump back right back into it. So if you guys have any questions, I'll be here for a couple minutes.